The summer of 1844 pressed down on Cumberland County, Tennessee, like a hot, damp cloth. Thomas Whitaker stood on the broad porch of Elmwood, his plantation home, watching thunderheads gather over the distant ridge of the Cumberland Plateau. At 53, Thomas's once auburn hair had faded to a reddish gray, his tall frame slightly stooped from years of overseeing his expanding empire of cotton fields and timber stands. Behind him, through the open doorway, came the muffled sounds of his daughter-in-law's labor. Sarah, his son William's wife, had been struggling for nearly 14 hours. The midwife, an elderly enslaved woman named Esther, had been summoned before dawn. Now, as evening approached, Thomas tightened his grip on the porch railing, feeling the smooth wood beneath his calloused hands. "Any news, father?" William emerged from the path leading from the fields, his boots caked with red Tennessee clay, shirt darkened with sweat. "Not yet," Thomas replied, not turning. "Esther says the baby's taking its time." William joined his father at the railing, removing his hat and wiping his brow with a handkerchief. At 26, he was the image of Thomas in his younger days, tall, broad-shouldered, with the same sharp blue eyes that could cut through excuses from field hands or business partners alike. "It's a boy," Thomas said with certainty. "Another Whitaker son, to carry on what we've built." William nodded, knowing better than to contradict his father's pronouncements. "The cotton's coming in well this season," he offered instead. "If prices hold, we'll clear enough to purchase that parcel from the Hendersons." Thomas nodded, but his mind remained elsewhere. 3 generations of Whitakers had worked this land since his grandfather had claimed it through a Virginia land grant. Each generation had expanded their holdings, accumulated more wealth, more land, more people. The Whitaker name meant something in Cumberland County. Power, prosperity, permanence. A piercing cry cut through the humid air, followed by the wail of an infant. William straightened, eyes fixed on the door. Thomas placed a heavy hand on his son's shoulder. "Remember what I taught you," he said, voice low and solemn. "A man's legacy is measured by what he builds and what he leaves behind." Inside, the master bedroom had been transformed. The heavy curtains were drawn against the evening light, oil lamps casting a golden glow. Sarah lay against the pillows, her nightgown soaked with sweat, auburn hair plastered to her forehead. In her arms, wrapped in a linen cloth, was a tiny, red-faced infant. Esther moved quietly around the room, her dark hands efficient as she gathered soiled linens. At 65, she had delivered nearly every child born at Elmwood for 3 decades, both in the main house and in the cabins beyond the kitchen garden. "A fine, healthy boy," Esther announced as the men entered, her voice carrying the soft cadence of the coastal Georgia, where she had been born. "Strong lungs on him, too." William approached the bed cautiously, bending to kiss his exhausted wife's forehead before peering at his son's face. "He's perfect," he whispered, touching the infant's curled fist with one finger. Thomas remained at the foot of the bed, watching the scene with a calculated gaze. "His name will be Jonathan Thomas Whitaker," he announced. It wasn't a suggestion. Sarah nodded wearily, too exhausted to argue. The name had been decided months ago. Jonathan for William's grandfather, Thomas for his father. The continuation of bloodlines, of legacy. "Bring the ledger," Thomas instructed his son. William hesitated for only a moment before leaving the room. When he returned, he carried a leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age, the binding cracked and repaired multiple times. Thomas took it without a word, placing it on the small writing desk near the window. He opened it carefully, fingers tracing down columns of figures and names. Esther's hands stilled as she gathered the bloody linens. Her eyes, clouded with cataracts but missing nothing, followed Thomas's movements. "The ink, William," Thomas prompted. William produced a small glass bottle and a pen from the desk drawer. Thomas dipped the pen carefully and began to write in a practiced hand. Jonathan Thomas Whitaker, born June 18, 1844, male, healthy. Estimated value, $500. The scratching of the pen against paper was the only sound in the room, save for the infant's soft whimpers. Sarah turned her face toward the wall, one tear tracking silently down her cheek. "Father, perhaps tomorrow would be better for this," William suggested quietly. Thomas finished writing with a flourish before looking up. "Business doesn't wait for sentiment, son. You'd do well to remember that." He closed the ledger with finality. "Every asset must be accounted for." Outside, thunder rumbled closer, and the first heavy raindrops began to strike the roof. The storm that had threatened all day was finally breaking. Thomas placed the ledger back in William's hands. "Keep this safe. One day you'll explain to your son what it means to be a Whitaker. What it means to build something that outlasts you." As Thomas left the room, Esther's eyes met William's over the cradle. Something unspoken passed between them. Understanding, perhaps, or resignation. The old ways persisted. The ledger recorded everything. Acres, livestock, equipment, enslaved people, and now, in its own perverse way, even the Whitaker children themselves, all assets to be counted, valued, and eventually passed down. In the slave quarters beyond the garden, another woman was in labor that night. Clara, barely 17, struggled alone in her small cabin, biting down on a folded piece of cloth to stifle her cries. No midwife had been called for her. No one marked the birth of her son in any ledger, though his arrival would later be noted in the inventory, another unnamed asset added to the Whitaker holdings. As the weeks passed, Jonathan thrived in the main house, surrounded by attention and care. Clara's son, whom she named Isaiah in the privacy of her prayers, faced a different reality. During the day, while Clara worked in the fields, Isaiah was watched over by an elderly enslaved woman named Martha, who cared for all the young children too small to work. By autumn, the cotton harvest was nearly complete. Thomas sat in his study reviewing the season's accounts with William. The ledger lay open between them, pages dense with figures. "We've cleared nearly 30% more than last season," Thomas noted with satisfaction. "The new field hands I purchased in Nashville are proving their worth." William nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Through the window, he could see Sarah walking in the garden, Jonathan in her arms. The baby was growing quickly, his face already showing the Whitaker features, the strong jaw, the clear blue eyes. "I've been thinking, Father," William began carefully, "about our methods." Thomas looked up sharply. "What methods?" "The way we manage the plantation. I've read about new techniques from England, crop rotation, improved tools, ways to increase yield without—" He hesitated. "Without expanding our holdings in certain areas." Thomas's expression hardened. "You mean without buying more slaves?" William met his father's gaze steadily. "Yes." For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Then Thomas closed the ledger with deliberate care. "These new ideas you've encountered, they come from men who have never worked a plantation, who don't understand our way of life. Our prosperity, your son's future, depends on the system as it stands. But if we could improve efficiency—" "Enough," Thomas cut him off. "Your grandfather built this legacy with his own hands, as did I. One day you'll understand what it takes to preserve what we've created." Later that evening, William walked alone along the path that led from the main house to the slave quarters. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and ripening apples. He paused at the edge of the small creek that divided the property, watching the moonlight ripple across its surface. The sound of singing drifted from the cabins. Low, mournful voices joined in harmony. William had heard these songs his entire life, yet somehow tonight they struck him differently. There was something in them, a longing, a depth of feeling, that made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't articulate. As he turned back toward the house, William spotted Clara carrying water from the well, her baby strapped to her back. Their eyes met briefly across the distance. Clara quickly lowered her gaze and hurried toward her cabin, but not before William noticed something in her expression. Not fear, exactly, but a guarded wariness that made him suddenly conscious of his position, of the power he wielded simply by virtue of his birth. That night, as William held his sleeping son, he found himself thinking about Clara's child, born just days apart from Jonathan. Two infants, two entirely different destinies, predetermined before either had drawn their first breath. He opened the drawer of his bedside table and removed the ledger his father had given him. By candlelight, he flipped through the pages. Generations of Whitaker accounting laid bare, names, figures, purchases, sales, human beings reduced to entries in columns. Near the back, he found the page where his father had recorded Jonathan's birth. His fingers traced over the words, "Estimated value, $500. The same amount they'd paid for Martha, the elderly woman who now tended the children in the quarters, when she'd been purchased at auction 20 years ago. William closed the ledger and returned it to the drawer. Outside, the singing had stopped, but its echoes remained in his mind, raising questions he had never before allowed himself to consider. Winter settled over Cumberland County with unusual severity. By January 1845, snow blanketed Elmwood's fields, and the Cumberland River had frozen along its edges. In the main house, fires burned continuously in the hearths, while in the slave quarters, people huddled together for warmth, stuffing rags into cracks between logs to block the biting wind. Thomas Whitaker viewed the harsh weather as an opportunity. With field work impossible, he redirected the enslaved men to clearing new land, backbreaking work of felling trees and pulling stumps in the frozen ground. Those who moved too slowly felt the overseer's whip. "We'll have 20 more acres ready for spring planting," Thomas announced proudly at dinner one evening. "This cold spell is a blessing in disguise." William glanced out the dining room window at the men returning from the forest, exhaustion evident in their stooped shoulders. "Perhaps we should rotate the work crews more frequently in this weather. Ellis told me 2 men have already fallen ill." Thomas waved away his concern. "Ellis coddles them. A little cold never killed a healthy man." "And what of the women and children?" Sarah asked quietly, her eyes on her plate. "The cabin roofs leak, and there's scarcely enough firewood." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Sarah had never before questioned plantation operations so directly. Thomas set down his fork deliberately. "My dear daughter-in-law, I admire your compassion, but these matters are best left to those who understand them." His tone was gentle but left no room for argument. "William, perhaps you should explain to your wife how a plantation functions." William cleared his throat. "Father's right, Sarah. There are complexities you don't fully grasp." Sarah's eyes flashed with rare defiance. "I understand enough. Clara's baby is sick. Pneumonia, Esther believes. While our Jonathan sleeps in a warm nursery, that child shivers in a drafty cabin." "That's quite enough," Thomas said sharply. "This discussion is inappropriate for the dinner table." Later that night, William found Sarah in the nursery, watching Jonathan sleep in his ornate cradle, a Whitaker family heirloom that had held 3 generations of firstborn sons. "You shouldn't challenge father that way," William said softly, "especially not in front of the servants." Sarah continued stroking Jonathan's cheek. "Is Clara's son not as precious as ours? Does he deserve to suffer because of circumstances he didn't choose?" William ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Of course not. But this is the way things are, the way they've always been. Things change, William. They must." Sarah finally looked up at him. "Your father has Jonathan in his ledger, valued like a horse or a plough. Doesn't that disturb you?" William couldn't meet her gaze. "It's just accounting. Father's method of keeping track of the estate's worth. It's more than that. It's how he sees the world. Everything, everyone, with a price attached." She took William's hand and placed it on their sleeping son's chest, feeling the gentle rise and fall. "Is this what you want Jonathan to learn? To value human life in dollars and cents?" The question hung between them, unanswered. Outside, the wind howled around the eaves, carrying the sound of someone coughing violently from the direction of the slave quarters. The next morning, William found Esther emerging from Clara's cabin, her face grave. "The child's fever broke in the night," she reported. but his breathing's still troubled, needs proper medicine, proper care. William glanced toward the main house, where smoke curled from the chimneys, promising warmth and comfort. Bring them both to the kitchen house, he decided suddenly. The small room at the back, tell Mrs. Patterson to prepare it. Esther's weathered face revealed nothing, but she nodded. Yes, Mr. William. When Thomas discovered the arrangement hours later, his fury was cold and contained. You undermined my authority, he told William in the privacy of his study. Worse, you've shown weakness. Sentimentality has no place in managing property. A sick infant is hardly a threat to your authority, Father, William replied, standing his ground. And Clara can still work. She's helping in the kitchen while the child recovers. Thomas's eyes narrowed. This isn't about one woman or one child. It's about order, structure. The moment you start making exceptions, treating them as... He searched for the word. As equals, everything we've built begins to crumble. Is that what you fear? William asked quietly. That seeing them as human beings will destroy us? Thomas slammed his fist on the desk, sending the inkwell toppling. Black liquid seeped into the papers beneath it, including a corner of the open ledger. You sound like those damned abolitionists in Boston. Is that what you've been reading? Those radical pamphlets? William watched the ink spread across the page, obscuring figures and names. I've been reading the Bible, Father. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. Thomas's face reddened. Don't presume to lecture me on scripture, boy. The patriarchs held slaves. It's the natural order God established. Perhaps we've misunderstood God's intention, William suggested, surprising himself with his boldness. Thomas stared at his son as if seeing him for the first time. Your grandfather would be ashamed of such talk. I certainly am. He reached for a cloth to blot the spilled ink, but the damage was done. The ledger page was stained beyond repair. Clean this up, he ordered, striding from the room. That night, for the first time in William's memory, Thomas dined alone in his study rather than joining the family at the table. Sarah took advantage of his absence to question Esther about conditions in the quarters. Most got 2 blankets per cabin, Esther explained reluctantly. Not enough with this cold snap. And the food rations haven't increased for winter. What do they need most? Sarah pressed. Esther's eyes darted to the doorway, checking for Thomas's presence. Blankets, medicine, more cornmeal and salt pork? She hesitated, then added softly, and hope, Miss Sarah. They need hope. The next day, Sarah convinced William to accompany her to Nashville on the pretense of purchasing fabric for new curtains. They returned with a wagon containing not only household goods for the main house, but also bundles of blankets, medicines, and foodstuffs that were quietly distributed to the quarters after dark. Thomas, increasingly isolated in his study with his ledgers and correspondence, remained unaware of these activities. As January gave way to February, his health began to decline. A persistent cough, night sweats, loss of appetite. The doctor from town diagnosed influenza and prescribed rest, but Thomas insisted on continuing to manage the plantation's affairs. Meanwhile, Clara's son recovered his strength in the relative warmth of the kitchen house room. Clara herself, seeing an opportunity, began teaching herself to read from scraps of newspapers and books she found while cleaning. Such learning was forbidden by law and plantation rules, but Mrs. Patterson, the cook, turned a blind eye, sometimes even helping with difficult words when no one else was present. By early March, as the first hints of spring softened the Tennessee landscape, a visitor arrived at Elmwood. James Whitaker, Thomas's younger brother, had made his fortune in shipping in Philadelphia and had gradually embraced abolitionist views, a fact that had caused a rift between the brothers lasting nearly a decade. "You look terrible, Thomas," James remarked bluntly after being shown into the study. At 48, James cut a different figure from his brother. Shorter, trimmer, dressed in the latest Eastern fashion, his manner more urbane. "Why are you here, James?" Thomas asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Come to lecture me again on the evils of our Southern way of life?" James sighed, removing his gloves. "I came because you're my brother, and I received word of your illness. Family matters, regardless of our differences." Thomas snorted derisively, but gestured for James to sit. "So says the man who hasn't set foot on Whitaker land in 8 years. "I see you're as stubborn as ever," James observed, taking the offered chair. "Some things never change." Thomas's retort was interrupted by a coughing fit. When it subsided, he wiped his mouth with a handkerchief already spotted with blood. "The world is changing enough without my help," he said bitterly. "Even my own son questions methods that have served the Whitakers for generations." James leaned forward, interest piqued. "William? Good for him. Perhaps there's hope for the next generation." "Hope?" Thomas laughed harshly. "Is that what you call it? Undermining everything our father and grandfather built? They built on shifting sand, Thomas. Surely you see that now. This system cannot last." Thomas's face hardened. "It will outlast me. That's all that matters." The brothers' reunion dinner that evening was a tense affair. William and Sarah were polite but guarded, uncertain of James's purpose in coming. Jonathan, now 9 months old and recently recovered from a mild fever of his own, was the only one who seemed genuinely delighted by the visitor, babbling happily from his high chair. "He has the Whitaker look," James observed, smiling at the child. "But perhaps his mother's gentler disposition, thankfully." "He'll be a fine businessman someday," Thomas interjected. "I've already set aside capital for his future ventures." James's expression sobered. "And do those ventures include the family's current investments?" The euphemism hung heavily in the air. "Uncle James is concerned about our souls, it seems," Thomas said sarcastically. "He believes owning property is a sin." "Not all property, brother," James replied evenly. "Just the human kind." William cleared his throat. "Perhaps we could discuss less contentious matters at dinner." "An excellent suggestion," Sarah agreed quickly. "James, tell us about Philadelphia. I've always longed to visit the eastern cities." The conversation shifted to safer topics. Philadelphia architecture, the latest fashions, President Polk's recent inauguration. But undercurrents of tension remained, particularly when a young enslaved boy named Marcus entered to clear the plates, and James made a point of thanking him directly, causing the child to look up in surprise before quickly lowering his eyes again. After dinner, while Thomas retired early, still weakened by his illness, James invited William to join him for a brandy on the porch. The night was mild, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. In the distance, the sounds of the quarters drifted on the breeze, voices, a harmonica, the rhythmic chopping of wood. "Your father tells me you've been questioning the old ways," James said without preamble. William swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "Not openly challenging, if that's what you're asking. Just wondering if there might be better methods." "Better for whom?" William gestured vaguely toward the quarters. "For everyone, including them." James studied his nephew's face in the dim light. "That's how it begins, you know. With questions. With seeing people where before you only saw property." He paused. "Your grandfather would have had the same reaction as your father. The first time I suggested our family's wealth came at too high a moral cost, he threatened to disown me. And yet you persisted. Some truths once seen cannot be unseen." James took a sip of his brandy. "I've built my business with free labor, paying fair wages. It's not only more ethical, it's more efficient in the long term." William leaned against the porch railing. "Father would never believe that. Your father is a product of his time and place, as was I once." James placed a hand on William's shoulder. "But you could be something different, for Jonathan's sake, if nothing else." William looked toward the main house where his son slept in his comfortable nursery. Then his gaze drifted to the kitchen house, where Clara and Isaiah had been allowed to remain even after the boy's recovery. 2 children, 2 futures, one predestined for privilege, the other for bondage. The arbitrary cruelty of it had begun to haunt his dreams. "What would you have me do?" he asked finally. "I can't simply free them all tomorrow." The laws don't permit it, and even if they did, where would they go? How would they live? James nodded soberly. The practical questions are real and complex, but they're secondary to the moral one. Do you believe holding human beings as property is right? William didn't answer immediately. In the silence, a mournful spiritual rose from the quarters, voices blending in harmony on the night air, singing of rivers and freedom and promised lands. The same songs he'd heard all his life, now striking him with new meaning. "No," he said at last, the admission both frightening and freeing. "No, I don't believe it's right." James squeezed his shoulder. "Then that's where you begin." April 1845 brought renewal to the Tennessee landscape. Dogwoods bloomed in white drifts among the pines, and the first tender shoots of cotton emerged in Elmwood's fields. But within the Whitaker household, the atmosphere remained strained. Thomas had recovered physically from his winter illness, but something in him had hardened further, as if his brush with mortality had intensified his determination to maintain control. James's visit had lasted only 4 days, but its effects lingered. After his departure, Thomas had discovered several abolitionist pamphlets among William's books, materials James had left behind deliberately. The confrontation that followed had been explosive, ending with Thomas threatening to change his will if William continued to entertain dangerous ideas. Now, as spring planting reached its peak, William found himself caught between conflicting loyalties, to his father and the Whitaker legacy on one hand, to his awakening conscience on the other. Sarah, whose own moral certainty had only strengthened over the winter, provided little comfort, her disappointed glances a constant reminder of his compromised position. "You must make a choice," she told him one evening as they prepared for bed. "You cannot serve 2 masters forever," William sighed, removing his watch from its pocket. "It's not that simple, Sarah. This land, this way of life, it's all I've known, all my father and grandfather knew. That doesn't make it right." Sarah brushed her hair with long, deliberate strokes, her reflection in the vanity mirror resolute. "Your uncle offered you a partnership in his shipping business. We could leave, start fresh in Philadelphia, and abandon everything, my inheritance, my responsibilities." Sarah set down her brush, turning to face him. "What of your responsibility to your son? What lessons will he learn watching his father uphold a system you yourself know to be immoral?" William had no answer. Later, unable to sleep, he slipped from bed and made his way downstairs. Taking a lamp from the hall table, he found himself drawn to his father's study, the heart of Elmwood's operations. The room was dark and still, smelling of leather, tobacco, and ink. William lit the lamp, its glow illuminating the heavy desk where generations of Whitakers had conducted business. The ledger lay closed upon it, a corner of one page still stained from the spilled ink months earlier. William opened it slowly, paging through the meticulous records. Here was the history of Elmwood, told in columns of figures and acquisitions. Here was the purchase of Esther in 1808, when Thomas was just 17. Here was the sale of a man named Solomon, sent to Mississippi in 1832 for attempting to escape. Here was Clara, acquired at auction in Memphis 3 years ago, her price noted as reasonable for a breeding female. And here, on a newer page, was Jonathan's entry, his birth recorded with the same clinical precision as any other asset. The ink was faded slightly where Thomas had written, "Estimated value, $500. William closed the book, a weight settling in his chest. He moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit grounds. From this vantage point, he could see both the grandeur of the main house with its columned facade and the crude collection of cabins that housed over 50 enslaved people. The contrast had never seemed so stark, so obscene. A movement caught his eye, a figure slipping between the cabins, moving with purpose toward the woods. William leaned closer to the glass, recognizing the slight form of Marcus, the 12-year-old boy who had served at dinner during James's visit. Without thinking, William extinguished his lamp and left the study, making his way through the darkened house and out a side door. The night air was cool and sweet with the scent of blossoms as he followed at a distance, curious rather than alarmed. Marcus moved with the confidence of someone who had travelled this path before, skirting the edge of a field before disappearing into a stand of trees near the property's eastern boundary. William hesitated briefly before following, conscious of twigs cracking beneath his boots. In a small clearing, illuminated by slivers of moonlight through the canopy, William discovered what had drawn the boy out at such an hour. Nearly a dozen people sat in a rough circle on the ground, men and women from the quarters, including Clara, with Isaiah sleeping against her chest. At the centre stood an elderly man William recognized as Gabriel, who'd been at Elmwood longer than anyone save Esther. They fell silent at William's approach, faces registering shock and fear. Marcus, who had been seated near Gabriel, scrambled to his feet, eyes wide with terror. "Master William," Gabriel finally said, his voice steady despite the situation. "We was just—" "I know what this is," William interrupted, surprising himself with his calm. He did know from whispered rumors and warnings, a prayer meeting, forbidden by plantation rules and Tennessee law alike. Enslaved people caught holding such gatherings could be whipped or worse. For a long moment no one moved or spoke. Then William made a decision that would alter the course of many lives, including his own. "Continue your worship," he said quietly. "I'll keep watch at the edge of the trees." Disbelief rippled through the gathering. Gabriel's weathered face revealed nothing, but his eyes studied William intently, searching for deception. "Why would you do that, Master William?" he asked finally. William considered the question, aware that his answer mattered profoundly. "Because faith belongs to everyone," he said at last. "Because prayer should be free." Gabriel nodded slowly, a barely perceptible smile touching his lips. "Then we'd welcome you to join us, if you've a mind to." William hesitated, then lowered himself to the ground at the edge of the circle. Marcus remained standing, uncertainty evident in his posture, until Gabriel motioned for him to sit. What followed was unlike any church service William had attended in the white-columned building in town. There were no hymnals, no written prayers, no pulpit. Instead, Gabriel spoke from memory, weaving together scripture with his own insights, his deep voice rising and falling with natural eloquence. The Israelites were slaves in Egypt, he reminded them. For 400 years they labored under Pharaoh's lash. But God didn't forget them. God heard their cries. "Amen," several voices murmured. And God sent Moses to tell Pharaoh, "Let my people go." Gabriel's eyes swept the circle, briefly meeting William's. Pharaoh's heart was hardened. He refused. But God's will prevails always. William listened, struck by the power and relevance of the ancient story to those gathered around him. He'd heard these biblical accounts his entire life, but never had they seemed so immediate, so charged with meaning beyond the comfortable lessons taught in the church he attended with his father. When Gabriel finished speaking, Clara began to sing, her clear voice rising in the night air. "Wade in the water, wade in the water, children wade in the water, God's gonna trouble the water." Others joined, the harmony complex and moving. William remained silent, listening, a witness to something profound and private. As the singing continued, Isaiah stirred against his mother's chest, his tiny hand reaching up to touch her face. William thought of Jonathan, sleeping in his ornate cradle back at the house. 2 children, born days apart, yet worlds separated by circumstances neither had chosen. For the first time, he allowed himself to fully confront the monstrous injustice of it. When the meeting ended an hour later, the participants dispersed quietly, returning to the quarters by different routes. William found himself walking alongside Clara, who carried the now awake Isaiah. "Thank you," she said softly, not looking at him directly, "for not reporting us." William nodded, unsure how to respond. After a moment he asked, "How often do you meet like this?" "When we can, when it's safe." She adjusted Isaiah in her arms. "It gives us strength, helps us endure." They walked in silence for several paces before William spoke again. Clara, if circumstances were different, what would you want for Isaiah? She glanced at him then, surprise evident in her expression. No white person had ever asked her such a question. Freedom, she said simply, to read without hiding, to keep what he earns by his own hands, to go where he chooses, without passes or permission. She looked down at her son's face, to never know the lash or the auction block. Her answer, straightforward, yet devastating in its humanity, lodged in William's heart. They parted at the edge of the quarters, William returning to the main house with his thoughts in turmoil. Sarah was awake when he entered their bedroom, sitting upright against the pillows, a book open in her lap. "Where have you been?" she asked, concern rather than accusation in her voice. William sat heavily on the edge of the bed. "Learning," he replied, "finally learning to see." The next morning, Thomas summoned William to the study immediately after breakfast. His expression was thunderous as he thrust a piece of paper across the desk. "Explain this," he demanded. William took the paper, recognizing it instantly. One of the abolitionist pamphlets James had left behind, which William had hidden beneath the mattress in the guest room. Someone had found it and delivered it to Thomas. "It's exactly what it appears to be," William said, deciding against denial. "A publication arguing for immediate emancipation of all enslaved people." Thomas's face flushed with anger. "And you kept this treasonous material in my house, where any impressionable servant might find it?" "I kept it to read, Father, to understand different perspectives." "Different perspectives?" Thomas scoffed. "Next, you'll be inviting Frederick Douglass to dinner." William set the pamphlet down on the desk. "Would that be worse than treating human beings as livestock? Recording my own son's birth in the same ledger where we record the purchase of people?" Thomas slammed his hand on the desk. "Enough. I've tolerated your questioning and your wife's interference all winter. No more." He stood, looming over the desk. "You have a choice to make, William. Either recommit yourself to this family's traditions and business practices, or forfeit your place in it. You would disinherit your only son? I would protect this family's legacy from those who would destroy it." Thomas's voice was cold. "Even my own blood." William stood as well, matching his father's stance. "And what of Jonathan's legacy? Will he thank us for leaving him a fortune built on suffering?" "He'll thank us for leaving him a fortune at all," Thomas snapped. "Something you seem increasingly willing to sacrifice for abstract principles." "They're not abstract to those who live in the quarters," William replied. "To Clara, to Isaiah, to Gabriel and Esther, they're flesh and blood, Father. Just like us." Thomas studied his son's face, his expression shifting from anger to something like pity. "You truly believe that, don't you? That they're the same as us? Created by the same God, deserving of the same dignity?" "Yes." Thomas sank back into his chair, suddenly looking older. "Then I've failed you as a father." He picked up the pamphlet between two fingers, as if it were contaminated. "You have 1 week to decide where your loyalties lie, with your family or with these ideas." William left the study without another word, the ultimatum ringing in his ears. 1 week to choose between inheritance and integrity, between wealth and moral courage. That evening, as sunset painted the western sky in shades of orange and gold, William walked alone to the family cemetery on a gentle rise behind the main house. 4 generations of Whitakers lay beneath marble headstones, including his mother, who had died when he was just 14. He stood before her grave, tracing the engraved lettering with his fingers. "Elizabeth Ann Whitaker, beloved wife and mother, 1801–1838. What would you advise, mother?" He whispered to the silent stone. "What would you have me do?" No answer came from the grave. But as William turned to leave, he noticed Gabriel approaching slowly along the path, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. The old man stopped when he saw William, uncertainty crossing his features. "Beg pardon, Master William. Didn't mean to intrude on your grieving." "You're not intruding, Gabriel." William gestured for him to continue. "Who are you visiting?" Gabriel moved forward cautiously, stopping before a plain stone marker set apart from the family plots, nearly hidden beneath an oak tree. He placed the flowers carefully at its base. "My wife," he said softly. 52 years we had together before the fever took her last spring. William looked at the simple marker, noting the absence of a name. Just a date, May 15th, 1844, carved roughly into the stone. He'd never noticed it before, despite countless visits to the cemetery. "I didn't know," he said, genuinely regretful. "What was her name?" Gabriel's eyes widened slightly at the question. "Rebecca," he answered after a moment. "Her name was Rebecca." William nodded, committing it to memory. "I'll have her name added to the stone if you'd like." Gabriel studied him, something like hope flickering in his weathered face. "That would be a kindness, Master William." They stood together in the gathering twilight, an unusual tableau, master and slave, yet in this moment simply two men honoring loved ones past. "I heard about Master Thomas's ultimatum," Gabriel said finally, his voice low. "News travels fast in the quarters." William wasn't entirely surprised. The walls of Elmwood had always had ears. "What would you do, Gabriel, if you were in my position?" The old man considered the question seriously. "I can't rightly say, never having had such choices myself." He paused. "But I know this. A man who stands for nothing will fall for anything." William recognized the wisdom in the simple statement. "And if standing costs me everything?" Gabriel looked toward the last gleam of sunlight on the horizon. "Some costs are worth paying, Master William. Some treasures ain't kept in ledgers." As darkness settled over the cemetery, William made his decision. He would not compromise his awakening conscience to preserve his inheritance. The path ahead would be difficult, possibly dangerous, but for the first time in his life he felt certain of his course. He didn't yet know how many others would be affected by his choice, or how dramatically it would alter the future of Elmwood Plantation and everyone who lived there. The true cost and the true value of moral courage remained to be revealed. The early summer of 1845 arrived at Elmwood with uncharacteristic heat, the sun blazing down on the cotton fields where rows of green plants stretched toward the horizon. In the main house, a different kind of heat had built to a breaking point. William stood in his father's study, the afternoon light streaming through the windows, illuminating dust motes in the air between them. Thomas sat behind his desk, the family ledger open before him, his face impassive as he listened to his son's decision. "I cannot continue to participate in a system I know to be wrong," William concluded, his voice steady, despite his racing heart. "Uncle James has offered me a position in Philadelphia. Sarah, Jonathan, and I will leave at the end of the month." Thomas's expression remained unchanged, but his knuckles whitened where he gripped the edge of the desk. "So you choose betrayal of your family, your heritage, your duty." "I choose my conscience, father, and my son's future." Thomas closed the ledger with deliberate care. "Then you are no longer my heir. I'll have the lawyers draw up the necessary documents today." William had expected this, had prepared himself for disinheritance, but the finality of it still struck him with physical force. "And what of the people here? What becomes of them?" "My property will be disposed of as I see fit," Thomas replied coldly. "That is no longer your concern." William took a deep breath. "Before we leave, I want to purchase Clara and her son. Name your price." Thomas laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "So the abolitionist wants to become a slave owner now? How convenient for your conscience." "I intend to free them once we reach Philadelphia." "Of course you do." Thomas shook his head in disgust. "The request is denied. I'll sell no one to you, least of all that woman and her child. They remain at Elmwood." William felt a surge of desperate anger. "Why, out of spite, to punish me, to remind you of the consequences of your choices?" Thomas stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "You have until the end of the month to vacate your rooms. Your allowance ends today." William left the study without another word, his mind racing. He had expected disinheritance, but not his father's refusal to sell Clara and Isaiah. Without legal means to secure their freedom, what options remained? Sarah was waiting in their bedroom, already packing trunks for their departure. Her expression fell as she read William's face. "He refused to sell them, didn't he?" she asked softly. William nodded, sinking onto the edge of the bed. "He knows I care about their fate. It's his final punishment." Sarah sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. "Then we must find another way." Over the next 2 weeks, William liquidated what personal assets he could: his horses, his fine watches, his portion of an investment in a Nashville mercantile venture. The funds would sustain them until he began work with his uncle, but wouldn't be enough to establish a new household in Philadelphia immediately. They would stay with James initially, a humbling circumstance that William accepted as the cost of his moral stand. Meanwhile, word of the rift between father and son had spread throughout Elmwood. In the quarters, people spoke in hushed tones about what it might mean for them. Some feared Thomas would sell off enslaved people in retaliation for William's departure. Others speculated that conditions might worsen under the elder Whitaker's undivided control. Gabriel, whose quiet wisdom had become increasingly important to William, offered what comfort he could to the others, while maintaining his own cautious hope. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he reminded them during a secret prayer meeting. "What looks like darkness may be the beginning of dawn." As June drew to a close, William made one final attempt at reconciliation, approaching his father after dinner as Thomas sat alone on the porch, smoking his pipe and gazing out at the fields. "Must it end this way between us?" William asked, leaning against the railing. "Can we not part as father and son, if not as business partners?" Thomas tapped his pipe against the arm of his chair, dislodging ash. "You made your choice, William. Live with it." "I'm trying to do what's right." "No," Thomas corrected sharply. "You're trying to feel right. There's a difference. Your moral preening will not feed a single hungry mouth or improve a single life, but it will cost this family its future." William sighed, recognizing the futility of further discussion. As he turned to leave, Thomas spoke again, his voice lower. "He looks like you know, your boy. The same expression when he's thinking." A pause. "He should grow up here, on Whitaker land. It's his birthright." William faced his father again. "A birthright stained with the blood and tears of others is no legacy I want for him." Thomas's expression hardened once more. "Then go. And don't expect welcome should you ever return." The night before their scheduled departure, William found himself unable to sleep. He slipped from bed, careful not to wake Sarah, and made his way downstairs and out onto the grounds. The July moon hung full and bright above Elmwood, casting the familiar landscape in silvery light. His footsteps carried him inevitably toward the quarters, where all was quiet, save for the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of night creatures in the underbrush. As he approached Clara's cabin, a shadow detached itself from the doorway. Gabriel, keeping watch. "Master William," the old man acknowledged softly, "thought you might come tonight." "Is everything prepared?" William asked. Gabriel nodded. "They're ready, packed what little they have." William glanced around nervously. "And the others we discussed. Marcus and his mother are coming too. And Esther, though she's afraid her old bones won't take the journey well." William had struggled with the decision to help more than just Clara and Isaiah escape. Each additional person increased the danger, to them and to himself. But in the end, he couldn't justify selecting only those few he had personal connection to. Freedom, if it meant anything, must be available to all. "The wagon will be at the North Creek crossing at midnight tomorrow," William confirmed. "I've arranged for a Quaker conductor to meet you there. He'll guide you north." Gabriel's eyes, wise with years of watching and waiting, studied William's face. "You're risking everything, Master William." "Not everything. Not my soul." William clasped the older man's shoulder. "Will you reconsider coming with them? You'd be welcome in Philadelphia." Gabriel shook his head. "My Rebecca lies here, and there's others who can't make the journey, the very young." the very old. Someone needs to care for them, help them hold on a while longer. He smiled faintly. Change is coming, Master William. I may not live to see it, but it's coming all the same. Inside the cabin, Clara sat on the edge of her pallet, Isaiah sleeping beside her. She looked up as William entered, her expression guarded despite their recent planning. "It's still happening?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "You haven't changed your mind?" "Everything is arranged," William confirmed. "This time tomorrow you'll be on your way north." Clara nodded, returning to the small bundle of possessions she was preparing. A change of clothes, a wooden doll William had given Isaiah, a Bible she had taught herself to read in secret. "What will happen to you?" she asked after a moment, "when Master Thomas discovers what you've done?" William had been avoiding this question, even in his own mind. Helping enslaved people escape was a serious crime in Tennessee. If caught, he faced imprisonment, ruinous fines, possibly worse. "I'll be in Philadelphia by then," he said with more confidence than he felt. "My father's influence doesn't extend that far north." Clara looked unconvinced but didn't press further. Instead, she reached beneath her pallet and withdrew something wrapped in a scrap of cloth. "I want you to have this," she said, offering it to him. "For Jonathan!" William unwrapped the cloth to find a small, intricately carved wooden horse. The craftsmanship was remarkable, each detail rendered with care, despite the simple tools available. "My father made it," Clara explained, "before he was sold south. It's the only thing I have from him." William tried to refuse. "Clara, this belongs to Isaiah. I can't take a family heirloom." "Please," she interrupted, "I want something of us to remain with Jonathan, so that someday, when he's grown, you can tell him our story. Tell him how his father chose what was right over what was easy." Touched beyond words, William accepted the gift, carefully rewrapping it in the cloth. "I'll keep it for him, and I'll tell him everything, I promise." The next day passed in a blur of final preparations. The Whitakers' trunks were loaded onto a hired wagon, ready for the journey to Nashville, where they would catch the northbound stage. Sarah moved through the house in a state of controlled efficiency, directing the packing, comforting Jonathan, who sensed the unusual tension, and occasionally casting concerned glances at William. Thomas remained in his study most of the day, emerging only briefly to issue instructions to Ellis, the overseer, regarding the next day's work assignments. He made no move to bid farewell to his son and his family, though William noticed him watching from the study window as they loaded the final trunk. As twilight descended, William found a moment to slip away to the family cemetery one last time. He knelt briefly at his mother's grave, then moved to Rebecca's marker, now bearing her full name, as he had promised Gabriel. "Watch over them," he whispered to both stones, "and forgive what I couldn't change." Returning to the house, William was surprised to find his father waiting on the porch, ledger in hand. "A parting gift," Thomas said without preamble, holding out the book. "Take it with you to Philadelphia. Perhaps when you're struggling to establish yourself there, you'll appreciate what you've thrown away." William accepted the ledger, its familiar weight and leather binding a tangible symbol of all he was leaving behind, and all he was rejecting. "Goodbye, Father," he said simply. Thomas didn't respond, merely turning and re-entering the house, the door closing firmly behind him. It was the last time William would ever see him. The journey to Nashville was uneventful, the hired driver asking few questions about the family's sudden departure. They took rooms at an inn near the stage depot, their ticket for the morning coach already secured. After settling Jonathan for the night, William claimed a need for fresh air and slipped out into the darkness. On the outskirts of town, he met the Quaker man who had agreed to help, Joshua Lippincott, a middle-aged farmer with kind eyes and a solemn demeanor. "Is thee ready for what must be done?" Joshua asked after introductions were made. William nodded, though his stomach churned with anxiety. "You understand the rendezvous point? North Creek Crossing? Midnight?" "I have guided many to freedom," Joshua assured him. "God willing, thy friends will soon know liberty." They parted with a handshake, William returning to the inn where Sarah waited anxiously. "It's done," he told her. "All we can do now is pray they make it safely." Sarah embraced him tightly. "You've done the right thing, William. Whatever comes, remember that." Back at Elmwood, as the household settled for the night, Clara gathered Isaiah in her arms and slipped from her cabin. Gabriel, Marcus, Marcus's mother Leah, and the elderly Esther were waiting at the agreed meeting spot behind the smokehouse. No words were exchanged as they moved silently toward the woods, each carrying a small bundle of possessions, their hearts pounding with fear and desperate hope. They followed the creek north, keeping to the shadows, freezing at every snapping twig or nocturnal animal sound. Isaiah, somehow sensing the need for silence, remained quiet in his mother's arms, his wide eyes reflecting the moonlight. When they reached the crossing point, Joshua was waiting as promised, a covered wagon concealed among the trees. "Quickly," he whispered, helping Esther climb aboard. "We have many miles to cover before dawn." As Marcus and Leah settled into the wagon, Clara paused, looking back in the direction of Elmwood one last time. For 17 years, it had been her prison. Now, holding her son close, she turned resolutely away and stepped into the wagon, toward an uncertain but free future. The escape was discovered shortly after dawn, when Ellis came to assign Clara to the laundry and found her cabin empty. The alarm spread quickly, Thomas Whitaker emerging from the main house in a fury, demanding immediate pursuit. But by then, Joshua's wagon was far to the north, having traveled through the night on little-used back roads. The small group of fugitives huddled beneath quilts, tense but hopeful, as each mile increased the distance between them and bondage. In Nashville, unaware of the commotion at Elmwood, William, Sarah, and Jonathan boarded the northbound stage as planned. As the coach lurched forward, beginning the long journey to Philadelphia, William held his son on his lap, the carved wooden horse tucked safely in his coat pocket. "What will happen to them?" Sarah asked softly, once they were well underway. "To Clara and the others." William gazed out the window at the Tennessee landscape rolling past, hills and forests that had been his home for all his life. "If they make it to Pennsylvania, James will help settle them. Clara wants to learn to be a seamstress. Esther can live out her days in peace. Marcus is young enough to get proper schooling. And us? What becomes of the Whitakers now?" William turned from the window to meet his wife's gaze. "We build something new, something Jonathan can be proud to inherit." He touched the pocket where the wooden horse rested. "Not an empire built on others' suffering, but a legacy of principle." Sarah took his hand, her expression resolute. "Then we begin again." As the stage continued northward, William thought of the ledger in their luggage, that record of commodified humanity that had shaped his family for generations. He would keep it, not as his father intended, as a reminder of lost wealth, but as a testament to the moral awakening that had led him here, to this moment of departure and new beginning. In that ledger, his son's birth was recorded alongside the purchases and sales of human beings. But Jonathan's true value could never be measured in dollars or recorded in columns of figures. His worth, like that of every child born into this world, lay in his inherent dignity, his potential, his sacred humanity. This was the truth William had finally come to understand, the truth that had compelled him to risk everything, to break with his father and the only life he had known. Some assets couldn't be counted or owned. Some treasures existed beyond the reach of any ledger. 6 weeks later, a letter arrived at James Whitaker's Philadelphia home, where William and his family had established themselves. It bore news from Cumberland County. Thomas Whitaker had suffered a stroke upon discovering the escape of his property and learning of his son's involvement. He lingered for 3 days before dying, unreconciled and unrepentant. Elmwood would be sold at auction, its human inhabitants dispersed to new owners, save for those few who had found their way to freedom. The Whitaker legacy in Tennessee was ending. That evening, William sat in his uncle's study, the wooden horse in his hands, turning it slowly in the lamplight. He thought of Clara and Isaiah, now settled in a small Quaker community outside the city, beginning their new lives as free people. He thought of Gabriel, left behind at Elmwood, his future now uncertain. He thought of his father, dying in anger and bitterness, unable to see beyond the ledger's columns to the humanity of those he had claimed to own. And he thought of Jonathan, sleeping peacefully upstairs, who would grow up in a different world with different values. One day, William would give him this carved horse and tell him the story of two boys born days apart, one to privilege, one to bondage, and of the choices that had ultimately brought them both to freedom. Outside, a summer storm was brewing, thunder rumbling in the distance. But within, William felt a peace he had never known at Elmwood. The price of conscience had been high, but its reward was beyond measure. The knowledge that he had at last chosen to stand on the right side of both history and humanity. As rain began to patter against the windows, William placed the wooden horse on the mantelpiece where it would remain for many years to come. A simple treasure, carried from bondage to freedom, a testament to the true worth of a human soul.